Welcome to the Second Bite Podcast, where we talk with top entrepreneurs and CEOs about creating valuable companies through creative transactions. Now, let's get started with the show.
Welcome to the Second Bite Podcast. Today, I've got a great guest, a repeat guest, Dr. Jeremy Weiss from Rise 25. Jeremy, happy to have you.
Awesome. we're going to talk about a great topic, right? Which is navigating key players in a transaction. You have many great episodes from both the private equity side, the digital agency side. I know you've had people who have bought the company and then the person who sold the company on both ends. So it's really interesting. But I feel like we haven't really touched upon the nuances behind navigating key players. So we're going to get into that today. Before we do, I want you to go through why it's called the Second Bite Podcast.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because a couple of people have asked me that recently. So that's lingo in our business, the second bite. What we really do, mostly for agency founders, is help them with a transaction, not necessarily to exit, but to accelerate their growth. And they get real they get real cash at close, significant amount of cash at close. They get more resources, more support, and they have significant upside and in the larger company that's been the acquirer, and that upside will turn into something hopefully much more significant in a 2 or 3 or 5 year period of time. And that second bite is what the podcast is named after and what we spend most of our time pursuing for clients.
I remember, after listening to your show and talking to you, it's definitely changed my perception on exiting, where it's not walking away and doing something else, but actually just growing the current business and asset even bigger under a bigger organization.
It is, it's an alternative that a lot of people say to me, gosh, I didn't know that this was an option. I thought if I ever sold my agency, I would have to go to work with a crappy job for a bigger organization for some period of time and hopefully survive. And then I go, retire. And as listeners of the podcast know, there's many, many alternatives other than a boring job afterwards.
So navigating key players in a transaction, I want you to talk about, and we hear this, if a founder wants to walk away and get the most value for their company, they should put a CEO in place and eliminate themselves, right? It's not always that simple.
It's not that simple. It's not, first of all, finding that person is not that simple. Motivating that person is not that simple. And I see more of them go wrong than go right. Number one. Number two, as soon as things get difficult, since that professional CEO has no equity, they'll just go take another job that'll start at a different structure and give them a bigger future. So it's hard to get somebody to stick in there. But I'll give you an example, and this happened recently. So we just sold an agency. Roughly, the transaction value is about $15 million. It's owned by 2 owners that are not active in the business. And the CEO that's been running the business and growing the business for the last 8 years does not have an equity position. So most people would say that's perfect because those guys can sell and they can leave. The challenge is that the buyer is going to do their diligence and they're going to identify key man risk. In this particular case, the man here was the CEO and they was the driving force behind the transaction. The owners bonused him 10% of the deal, $1.5 million. He got some of it in a longer term incentive, but he was getting $1.2 million at close. Number one, the $1.2 million is a bonus because he didn't have equity. So it's taxed as ordinary income. So now he's down to $800,000-ish. That's less than 2 years of his salary. He knows every important customer. He's the driving force. He's the personality. He's all those things. all those things that you think you want, right? And where the rub is that because he's not an owner, he needs now to sign a non-compete agreement and a non-solicit agreement. Those are very difficult to enforce as an employment agreement, but as part of a transaction, it's fully enforceable. We negotiated the employment agreement down to no non-compete, no non-solicit in the event that they're fired without cause. The buyer was willing to do that, which is unusual. The buyer was willing to do that because they would never consider buying the agency without that CEO running it. That was an easy one for them. We absolutely have to have this guy. The second challenge was the guy did not want to have a non-compete if he just didn't like it and didn't want to work there anymore. And so, you're to express it another way, you're going to get $1.2 million at close. And on Monday, if you want to compete against us and go after all the clients, you want that to be your option with no restriction. And so, of course, a buyer would never do that, let alone the fact that they're writing a $15 million, it wasn't all in cash, but they're writing a significant check. And this is the important part, Jeremy. Nobody is going to do that. So this great solution of let's go get an outside CEO is not as simple and straightforward as that. There's like most things in life, there's more complication to that. So we worked it out where the CEO really did want to stay there. The buyer was really good. It was a private equity backed company. A bunch of things went right, but that delayed the deal, held it up, put it in jeopardy, on and on from that standpoint. The end solution, and I don't know, by the way, what would happen if they weren't willing to very generously give this guy 10% of the company, right? So I think that's one thing that people very much oversimplify, that if we just go get a CEO to run the business, we can walk away without complication.
I'm curious, from a private equity vantage point, what do they see that would minimize the key person risk? Because in the founder's perspective, I'm going to give this guy 10%. This woman or guy 10%. In this case, over $1 million. Great. That's going to incentivize to push the transaction through, but not necessarily stay. So what is from the private equity side, what do they want to see to minimize the key person?
It's a really good question. So oftentimes when you go through a transaction, somewhere the seller says to themselves, what am I doing? And why am I doing it? And is this going to be everything they tell me? And then they look over at the check that they're going to get and they're like, all right, I'm going to give it a go. If that check is meaningful enough, and if they believe the buyer enough, and on from that standpoint. So when you don't have that in this particular case, when you don't have a significant chunk of money, that becomes harder. One thing that would have solved this is that 8 years ago when they hired this CEO, if they would have had him sign a non-compete agreement. A lot of guys don't think about that, right? And when they're hiring somebody, that would have made the private equity buyer dramatically more comfortable.
Because at that point, 8 years, a person's like, I'm not signing it at this point. Right? Very much could, right? So, but at least there's protection around those clients based on that agreement. So that, that's one thought from that standpoint. The real issue for the buyer is, and good buyers, is always, where is their risk, right? We're writing a big check. How do we lose on this bet, if you will? And in the agency business, as you know, it often comes down to clients, because clients represent the revenue stream. Clients stay, A, because of performance, and B, because of relationships. And then the staff too.
That's all like the relationship part, right? So if the relationship falls to an individual, that's riskier. And that's why smaller companies trade at a multiple much less than larger companies, because, I went to, pick the large company. We do business with Transamerica Trucking, because if that driver doesn't show up, they'll send another one, right? If I'm dealing with Bill and Fred's Trucking and Fred's sick and Bill's already out on a run, well, yeah, I don't know who's going to come get my stuff. And so that business would trade less because of that very risk.
So the private equity, they, in this situation too, would look at the non-compete, non-solicit. Do they care if that executive or person has equity? Then does that make them feel better about it or worse, or does that change?
If they have equity going forward, yes. Right? Because in theory, they're part of the transaction. Here's the other thing. In most transactions, there is a non-compete and non-solicit for 5 years. That's market. The market is 4 to 5 years. That's where the market's at right now. That is fully enforceable as part of a transaction, right? When there's an exchange of benefit. What people hear oftentimes in the press is non-competes are not enforceable. And as an employee, that's true. It varies by state, but it's difficult to enforce a non-compete. If it's part of a transaction and somebody owns equity, it's fully enforceable as part of the transaction.
You mentioned, equity going forward. And you did a great interview with Jeff Spanbauer on your podcast. I encourage people to check it out. And you talked about briefly, but maybe have you expand on it, where you're talking about Class A shares, B shares, C shares, and going forward. So talk a little bit about kind of that, what that means for going forward for a key staff member.
Sure. So there's a couple of things, and I'll give you an example. In a recent transaction, well, let's go back to this transaction. They wanted the executive to have equity in the new company, this CEO. So part of that $1.5 million, roughly, I think it was 300 or 400,000, went to stock. Okay. So let's make it up and say it's 500,000. So when you get $1 million in cash and you have to pay tax on it, that's not that much fun. It reduces the $1 million. What's worse than that, if you get $500,000, which does not have liquidity, you get $500,000 in equity and you owe $200,000 in taxes on it. So let's say if that was the makeup, right? This guy got $1.5 million, has to pay, let's call it 400,000 of tax, probably 450 of tax on the million, plus another 200 of tax on the stock that they got. So they owed $650,000 in tax on $1 million. That just pisses people off, right? So very creatively, the buyer said, we're going to give you incentive units. And so the incentive unit has a floor price of in this example, it could be all over the place, has a floor price of $1. You're getting now 500,000 shares priced at $1, not at zero. So you don't have a $500,000 gain, you have a zero gain. So there is no tax on the 500,000. When we sell the stock in the future, let's say that it's worth $5 a share, you benefited from $1 up to $5. You made $4 a share. Times 500 is $2 million. But you paid nothing to get in on tax-wise up front. So they created incentive units to be much more tax efficient. This is a very sophisticated buyer with a smart private equity group and a good law firm behind them, and on from that standpoint. Sometimes there's some deals where when they buy the first company, a private equity group buys Rise 25, and they say, okay, Jeremy, we're going to start with A shares. And A shares is going to be valued at $1, and it's going to pay an 8% dividend that accumulates. You have $5,000 worth of shares because that's how much equity you have left. Times 8, that's $400,000 a year, right? At the end of 5 years, that's an extra $2 million. So the A shares, the 8%. So let's just make up an example and say you sell the business now for $50 million. The private equity money, your money, and any of the A shareholders, the obligation to them has to be paid first. So the $2 million I just referenced, and let's say for private equity, they get another 10, which means the $50 million you sold for doesn't get distributed amongst all the shareholders. It's $38 million that gets distributed between all the shareholders because the $12 million went out to the A shareholders, right? You might have B shareholders, and the B shareholders might have no preference, which is most likely. Preference. When you sell, making up examples here, the A shareholders may have decided that they get a 2x return before any distributions to anybody else. So on the 50, let's say they put in 10 to make it work. You have 5. You got 5 of theirs. They started with 10. So the 10 has to be paid back at 20. So out of the 50,
they agreed to get paid 2 times
before distributions.
Yeah.
So it essentially is, who's in line to get paid what when. And so always all the debt, all that stuff has to be paid off. The obligations of the business to the A shares, then the preference to the A shares. So maybe out of that 50, we're left with 30. And 30 might be a fantastic result. It may, but it's not going to be the same result as a 50, right? And these are things that you need to understand in a transaction.
Thanks for saying that, because, that is part of when you're talking about that key person. You're looking at, okay, is there a non-compete in place? And then do they have stake going forward, right? Equity going forward.
I'll give you we did another transaction just a couple years ago. And this agency had 2 key salespeople. One made $700,000 a year. The other made $550,000. They've been with the business for a long time. They essentially own and control the client relationship. Probably not as much as most salespeople think they do, right? The self-importance of most salespeople is probably a little bit more than what the market would be. But the buyer said these 2 they control all the clients. They can't leave. Because in a sense, they could leave, take their relationships and go over to another firm and bring all those clients over there. We're buying a business that's got $5 million of EBITDA. If all those clients left and we paid X amount for a $3.5 million EBITDA business, we way overpaid.
The big risk.
Yeah. So let's just get a non-compete on these guys. And guess what those guys said? Not signing a non-compete. I've never signed a non-compete. I would never sign a non-compete. And as you would imagine, like all good salespeople, the solution is always money. So, and I don't want to, I think saying that they extorted money from my client would be too strong, but it wouldn't be super strong. And at the same time,
they had leverage.
100% they had leverage. I think about it from the sales guy's perspective. They're making that much money because they are very, very good salespeople. They control relationships. They bring in revenue. They go hunt it down. They bring it in. They do it all. And as most agency owners know, on your best salespeople, this agency wouldn't be where it is if it wasn't for me. I don't have any equity. This is my chance to get something special. It might be the only chance I ever get. So I'm going to hit it. And so if your best salespeople are not under a non-compete, that's the type of thing you could probably expect in the future.
So how do you help navigate that negotiation? Because that's a tough one. Because like on one hand, the transaction is not going to go through if the people, and it sounds like the people were kind of digging their heels in.
Yeah. And remember, I don't really know the salespeople, and the agency owner's known them for a dozen years. It's always about money. Sometimes money turns into emotion. And when that happens, things start to go sideways. Right. And so there was a couple of heated conversations about who's going to get what. And I built you and you're nothing without me. And we've got a whole implementation team here. It's more than just you, and, on and on. And somewhere in between, this is what I spend my time solving and resolving, right? It's issues like this, and they're real and they're important to everybody. And in most cases, money solves it.
And so you kind of help lay that out.
Yeah. And just, we try to be, we're always focused on what it will take to get a deal closed. And for example, on the first one I mentioned to you, the solution was the CEO was very concerned that private equity wasn't going to be everything they told me. And emotionally and financially, I cannot afford to not work for a year. Even though they're getting $1.2 million, again, $1.2 million after taxes is $750,000 or whatever it is. They're making almost $600,000 as the CEO of this business. It's so I went to the two owners that are, again, not in this business or in another business. I said, you got to hire the guy. If he quits, you hire him to run this business for half of what his salary is, because it's his choice. He's got to feel some of the pain. And, and so these are the things that we spend our time doing to solve problems. There's plenty of little things that need to get tied down to get a deal over the finish line.
Sometimes a lot of creativity, I guess.
Yep.
One of the other questions I had, Todd, was on the front end, right? Hiring the CEO. So someone may be listening to this and they're still the CEO, right? And I'm curious on any advice or experience you've seen of maybe what works and what doesn't work. Because you mentioned on the front end that some people just do it all wrong in the first place. So
yeah, you have no better leverage than at the time you hire someone. And I say that, and maybe that's not true, right? Maybe this guy's deciding between you and somebody else, and you really need him and you like him as the best guy you found or best woman you've ever seen at the job. And the other guys aren't asking her to sign a non-compete. I think what I wanted to get out on this episode is it's going to come back. If you let it, it will, right? And it'll probably come back at an inconvenient time. And it's not certainly not unusual that an executive at that level, what goes along with that is severance, right? So that's usually the trade-off. If you're ever terminated without cause, or you quit for good reason, we'll pay you 3 months, 6 months, whatever the case may be.
And on the topic of kind of navigating key players in a transaction, I would love to hear your thoughts on communication with the team in the process. Because I know you had Jason Hennessy on,
yep.
And you talk a little bit about this on that episode where it's like, okay, what do I tell them? When do I tell them? People are thinking, even I think Jeff mentioned this too on his, like when you tell someone that, they're just thinking, do I still have a job? They're just, all these thoughts are rolling around. So how do you recommend messaging it and maybe at what point in the process? I'm sure there's a lot of different case scenarios here, but maybe just speak to that.
Yeah, I'll give you a couple thoughts. First, you can go search the search bar on Second Bite Podcast and look up Grayson LaFrance, the founder of Power Digital. I asked him that question. I said, when did you bring the team into the conversation? He said, the day I hired him. Every single person knows we're doing big things here and we can't fuel this growth all by ourselves. We're going to bring on partners along the way. And that was his approach. I would say
there's no shock to it. Like from the
there's no shock to it. Yeah. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to grow a big business. At some point, we're going to need some financial help to grow it into something bigger. And we'll keep you posted on what's important and what's not. What most people do is they bring in a small group once they are close to or about to sign the LOI. There you go. There's Grayson. So if you say something, will that show up on the screen? Yeah, I'm sure you will. So at some point, you need to bring in the other team. I would say this from a very pragmatic standpoint. It is great to have help going through due diligence, divide and conquer on the work. The other softer side of that is, as you know, every agency has key people. And everybody listening has told those key people, you're critical to the business. We trust you. You're important, on and on and on. This is a great time to show them and to prove it to them, right? And you should think about, are you going to give them any kind of a bonus? Are you going to do anything for a transaction, right? All that is part of the consideration. But I think again, for the type of transactions we do, not much is going to change post-transaction in terms of the team. The reason why this group is interested in buying us is because of the team. That group, the group buying us, wants to be bigger and go faster. In the agency space, that means more people, not fewer. So we're super excited because we do this and they do that and they think it will fit together like this. I have only told you and Sally and Steven and Janet. So it's just the four of us until we're further down the road. Then we'll tell a little bit wider team and so on. So, your finance person, your operations person, people will help you a ton with due diligence. And here's the other thing. It's maybe a little bit different with the remote workforce now, but this is important. People are going to start to whisper and talk. And in the absence of information, they'll imagine bad things. And nobody's going to reach out to you as the founder. That's not the protocol in any agency. They're going to reach out to their report, your first, second level of management. You got to have those people excited about the deal because they're going to sell the others on why it's a great opportunity for everybody. So it's a great question, Jeremy, because the communication is a really important part of it.
Yeah, I think Jeff even mentioned that in the interview you did with them on that specific nuance that you talked about, just making sure the key leaders were all excited so that messaging is congruent.
And the truth of the matter is, in almost every transaction we do, your best people, your A people will have a bigger opportunity to do bigger stuff. And they love that. The people that complain the most are going to be your C players, which should be no surprise to anybody.
Well, first of all, Todd, I want to point people to check out more episodes. Go to thesecondbitepodcast.com to learn more. Are there any other items that you think we need to explore when we're talking about navigating key players in a transaction?
I think we covered that really pretty well. I think that, we have a lot of conversations on the podcast with folks that have done, like Jeff, right? Folks that have done transactions, and those are interesting. A really interesting, there's the PE Insight series, which we interviewed 8 private equity guys. We asked one question and then got 8 private equity answers right behind that. That was so popular last year. We're rerunning that one. And then we did a similar concept with 8 founders. We might have called it the Founders Insight Series, that talks about what it's like post-transaction. And so, do I have a job now? What was due diligence like? And then again, I think I had 6 or 8 founders that have been through a transaction talk about what it was really like for them. So those you can check on specific. That it's a little bit more designed to be.
Yeah, you could see them here. I'm just sharing on the screen as you're talking, if people are watching the video, but there you can type in PE Insight Series into the search, and you can see what drives true value in a transaction, eliminating friction in deal negotiations. There's a number of them here.
And if you put in founder in the search box, you'll see that series. And so the concept there was we would talk about specific topics.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
So that's the one right there. Agency growth questions. The Agency Growth Advisor series. That was another one. That was a great one too. So you can, if you just search probably by series, you'll get a couple of good ones. There's a bunch of information that is diced in topics in those series, and the others are just conversations with founders that have done transactions. And we can certainly talk about the specifics of it. I think hearing it from a contemporary or a fellow agency founder is probably a little bit more entertaining and interesting. So, I mean, that's the whole purpose of the podcast.
Todd, always a pleasure. Thanks for having me. Everyone check out secondbitepodcast.com to learn more and check out more episodes.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks for listening to the Second Bite Podcast. We'll see you again next time, and be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.